everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Source. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak. Here in America, we are quickly approaching the 59th presidential election, where President Donald Trump will be challenged by former Vice President Joe Biden and third-party candidates Joe Jorgensen of the Libertarian Party, as well as Howie Hawkins of the Green Party. Now, there is a lot to discuss and a lot has taken place over these past few weeks, and joining me to discuss all things related to this U.S. election is Tim Canova. Tim is an attorney and law professor and formerly ran for Congress in 2016 and in 2018. Tim, I want to thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Taylor.
So before we get into our discussion on the U.S. election, Tim, I wanted you to describe your background for our viewers. In 2016 and in 2018, you made national news when you ran for Congress against Debbie Wasserman-Schultz. Can you speak about your race against her and why you chose to run for Congress in the first place?
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm a law professor and I've been teaching in the areas of central banking as well as international trade and finance. And in 2015, I reached out to my local congresswoman, Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, contacted her office because I wanted to share my views about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I was critical of the TPP for the way it was infringing upon sovereignty and empowering multinational corporations. And I was frustrated that I couldn't get through to anybody at Wasserman-Schultz's office. And I ended up joining up with the Citizens Trade Campaign, which was lobbying all the members of Congress in Florida and around the country against the TPP. And out of frustration, ended up protesting outside of her office a number of times. And Wasserman-Schultz was the only Democrat in Florida's congressional delegation to vote to fast-track the TPP. And we soon learned that she had taken over $330,000 from big corporate interests that wanted the TPP. So at that point, we started to look for someone who would challenge her in a Democratic primary. This district is heavily Democratic. It's been gerrymandered, a safe seat for Democrats for many years. And we had trouble finding anyone who was interested in challenging Wasserman-Schultz, not because she was beloved, quite the opposite. It was more that she was quite feared. She was the chair of the Democratic National Committee at the time. So I kind of got talked into considering it. And then by the end of the year in 2015, it became increasingly apparent that Wasserman-Schultz was abusing her power as the chair of the DNC to try to help Hillary Clinton's campaign against the insurgent challenge by Vermont's Senator Bernie Sanders. And it also became quite apparent to me that she was very vulnerable, and that if we jumped in, if I ran against her, that we might be able to tap into the sort of national grassroots funding base. And that's exactly what happened. I jumped in early 2016 and almost immediately made a splash and started to raise serious money in small donations online. We ultimately raised almost $4 million from over 209,000 individual donations. And we plowed that money back into the district with 4 field offices, which is really kind of unheard of to have that much of a ground effort in this day and age. To give you some idea, Bernie Sanders had only 1 field office in all of South Florida, and we had 4 field offices in our one little district. And we had a couple of hundred folks working full time, knocking on doors. We were knocking on over 12,000 doors a week at the peak of that campaign in the August heat and humidity in South Florida.
So Debbie Wasserman-Schultz was implicated in WikiLeaks documents, specifically the DNC emails, and this, of course, came out in 2016. Can you speak on that?
Sure. When the DNC WikiLeaks emails came out, it was an explosive moment. Our campaign was already on fire, and we had already raised at least $2 million, I believe, by then. And we were already, firing on all cylinders. When the WikiLeaks, the DNC leaks emails came out, though, it took it to another level. I remember early in my campaign, there were some advisors who were saying that in the summer when the Democrats would have their convention that Wasserman-Schultz would be getting a lot of free press, being up on the stage at the convention. And I remember at the time I said, well, just tell me, how can she get off that big stage without being booed off the stage? Well, it turned out because of the DNC leaks, she didn't even make it to the big stage. She got booed off a small stage the day before the convention started and was forced to resign as chair of the DNC. You know, as the DNC leaks also revealed, the DNC was surveilling our campaign, monitoring us. My name appears 100 or 200 times in those DNC leaks as well.
Now, she ended up winning both the 2016 and 2018 elections. And in fact, you filed a lawsuit against potential election fraud. Can you speak on that and the end result?
Sure. By the end of our 2016 campaign, and this was a late August 2016 Democratic primary, our field numbers showed us running away with it, that it wasn't even close at the end. And that's certainly the way it appeared on the ground at all the early voting sites and on election day. So when the polls closed and within an hour they declared Wasserman-Schultz the winner by 13 percentage points, it seemed very fishy to a lot of folks, including me, and I never conceded. And then in the days after that election, I was hearing from election experts all over the country who had been looking much more closely at the final numbers and finding them mathematically implausible. They had done cumulative voter tallies, all kinds of analysis of the numbers. So there was a lot of chatter coming my way and around the country that Wasserman-Schultz had rigged this election. And I thought the best way to get to the bottom of it and put an end to the speculation was simply to inspect the ballots. And we thought we would inspect the ballots in maybe a dozen key precincts out of 200 precincts. And if those ballots lined up with the official results, then we'd leave it be. But that's really where the story starts in many ways. We put in our public records request, and the supervisor of elections at the time was Brenda Snipes, one of the Wasserman-Schultz cronies, part of the Wasserman-Schultz political machine. She stonewalled our public records request. And in Florida, we have statutory and state constitutional rights to inspect the ballots. So I finally, after 6 months, filed a lawsuit in the Florida Circuit Court. And while we were in the middle of the lawsuit, 3 months into it, and 3 days after serving discovery requests, Brenda Snipes destroyed all the ballots that were cast in that race. And those are felonies under state and federal law. These are crimes punishable by up to 5 years in prison. And even then, after destroying the ballots, Brenda Snipes withheld that information from the court, from my lawyers and me for more than 2 months. We took her deposition. We had a sworn videotape deposition in which she admitted to destroying the ballots. And the judge ultimately granted a summary judgment. We won the case. All we got were our attorney's fees, which were, I believe, around $150,000. But we got no other relief because the relief was really the ballots. And we would never get to see the ballots and never really get to know what the actual results of that race were. The judge issued a 10-page order, and in his written opinion, he listed out all of the state and federal crimes that Snipes had committed. And we thought that would be the turning point, that once the case was resolved and the judge had found these crimes to have existed, that it would move from the civil to the criminal courts. And to our surprise, even the Republicans in Tallahassee, we had a Republican governor at the time, Rick Scott. The Republicans in Tallahassee were not interested in investigating or prosecuting. And my lawyer spoke to the acting U.S. attorney in South Florida, Benjamin Greenberg, and they spoke for almost 2 hours, and Greenberg sounded very interested in prosecuting. After all, we were handing them an open and shut case on a silver platter. And unfortunately, Greenberg then went to Washington, D.C., for a week of meetings at the Justice Department with Rod Rosenstein, who was then the Deputy Attorney General, who had appointed Bob Mueller to investigate on the entire Russia collusion fantasy. And Greenberg came back to Florida and suddenly was not interested in prosecuting this open and shut case whatsoever. So that was a very unsatisfying result. At that point, I exited the Democratic Party and continued running against Wasserman-Schultz for 2018 as an independent.
I know what we stand for, and I'll keep standing for it. You know, I'm not a career politician, and every time somebody calls me a politician, I sort of chafe at it.
And that race was equally unsatisfying. In the final weeks of that election, a Republican news outlet, the Floridian Press, had reported on a Republican poll that had Wasserman-Schultz and me tied at 34% each, with the Republican in third place at 13%, I believe, and about 18% undecided. And we found this to be very believable. Again, it's a heavily gerrymandered district, about 40% Democrat, 35% independent, and I think 25% Republican. And in the final couple of weeks, the momentum seemed to swing our way. Once that poll, or a report of that poll, was published, a lot of Republicans started coming our way, and a lot of Democrats who were worried about voting against the Democrat seemed to start breaking our way. So we had hopes that we might win a close three-way race. Again, the polls closed, and an hour later, Wasserman-Schultz was declared the victor. And the results were just completely unlikely. She was suddenly the most popular Democrat in all of the state of Florida. And I was pinned at a very low percentage point, I believe 5%. And the statisticians, the experts in computational science, the election experts, took a look at those numbers and said they were mathematically impossible. I didn't just get 5% of the overall vote. I got that same low percentage in every demographic group, among Democrats, Republicans, independents, blacks, whites, Hispanics, males, females, and every precinct, regardless of size. In fact, the chair of the New Jersey Institute of Technology, somebody very well credentialed, said it was as unlikely as winning the lottery every day for a year. And then when you start looking at the forensics, it turns out that all of the electronic tabulation machines, and this is something we discovered in the course of our investigations, and we publicized it, every electronic tabulation machine had wireless cellular modems on them. So that's not a back door, that's a front door for hackers to come in and manipulate the software. And the company that makes these machines, Election Systems and Software, ES&S, at first denied that this was the case, and only recently admitted that it is true that their electronic machines do have wireless cellular modems on them. And then the paper ballots were equally troubling. We had a volunteer at one of the election day voting sites who took videotape of, on her cell phone, I believe, of ballots being offloaded from cars that were pulling up and loaded onto a rented truck. There were no sheriff's deputies signing for receipt of the ballots, no chain of custody. And we posted that video online on Twitter, and we got over 2 million views within a couple of days, and still no investigations. It's really quite troubling, the lack of transparency in these elections. I think if they can do it here in Broward County in South Florida, it certainly could be done all over this country. And in fact, the experts tell me that 98% of the jurisdictions in this country are operating electronic voting machines that are inherently vulnerable to hacking or manipulation of the software by insiders.
So later on, we will return to some of the themes that you had just addressed, but now I do want to focus on this upcoming election and specifically Trump versus Biden and their policies. So what are some of the key differences between these two candidates, and what are some of their similarities?
Well, the differences are quite incredible. The progressive of the two of them, has not started a new foreign war. The first president not to start a new foreign war in 39 years. You have to go back to Jimmy Carter. Trump has continued to prosecute existing wars, but he hasn't started a new one. And of course, we just learned of the third peace deal that he's helped broker between Israel and an Arab hostile country. The latest being Sudan, I believe Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates were before that. One candidate was among the architects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That would be Joe Biden. The other, Donald Trump, killed the TPP almost immediately upon taking office. Trump has also been a constant critic of the Federal Reserve. That's an area that I'm very familiar with. I've been writing about the Federal Reserve for many years from a critical perspective. And in fact, in 2011, Senator Bernie Sanders appointed me to a select advisory committee on reforming the Federal Reserve. Whereas Trump might be critical of the Fed, Biden has taken an awful lot of money from Wall Street interests. And then, of course, there's criminal justice reform. Joe Biden was one of the drafters of the Crime Control Act of 1994 when he was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was in an administration for 8 years as vice president that threw fuel on the fire of mass incarceration by privatizing prisons. And Donald Trump signed the First Step Act, the first progressive criminal justice reform in many, many decades. So I think there's a real case that can be made that when you look at the actions as opposed to the words of these two candidates, that Donald Trump is actually the more progressive on many issues than Joe Biden.
That's a very interesting perspective. And so-called anti-establishment figures on the left, including AOC, Tulsi Gabbard, and Bernie Sanders, have each put their support behind establishment candidate Joe Biden. And Joe Biden, of course, has been in politics for decades. But these left-wing figures have even gone as far as to actively work on his campaign. This is all under the idea that they could perhaps push Biden to the left. Do you think that that is a reasonable assumption?
No, not whatsoever. I don't believe that any of these so-called progressives that you just mentioned are going to extract any kind of promises or any kind of action in a Biden administration, should there be one. I think it's a fool's errand. They've been sheep herding, trying to keep Democrats, keep voters in line, keep them coming to the Democratic Party. What I find completely unsatisfying is that the Democrats talk like they're liberal and talk like they're progressive, and yet when you look at their actions, whether they're in power or not, it is so far from progressive and far from liberal. They are now championing censorship, whether it's through the mainstream media or social media big tech giants. And strangely enough, after 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House, Trump is still the outsider.
I also want to touch on this latest expose to come from the New York Post. So, of course, the New York Post has published an article which really exposed Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and his overseas business dealings. The Post obtained emails that were found on Hunter Biden's laptop, which also implicated Joe Biden. Can you explain what these emails revealed and why this is so significant?
Well, my understanding is that the emails initially revealed this sort of international pay for play. And we've been hearing about it for quite some time. It's just that the New York Post article finally has more concrete evidence, you could say, as far as what is on Hunter Biden's laptop. And the international pay for play seems to be that Hunter Biden would accompany his father on Air Force Two wherever the vice president was flying around the world. And Hunter Biden would have meetings with powerful people in these countries, whether it's Ukraine or China or other countries. And according to the emails that the New York Post is writing about, Hunter Biden was actually talking about 10% of whatever monies his business was collecting would go to the big man, presumably his father. So what's troubling, of course, is that this laptop was in the hands of the FBI many months ago, in December of 2019, while the impeachment effort was gathering steam among the Democrats. And the FBI apparently did nothing with that laptop, even though the emails pertaining to Ukraine would be very relevant to the impeachment of the president. The president was essentially impeached for having a telephone conversation with the Ukrainian president, asking about the allegations about Joe Biden. And that was an impeachable offense, according to the Democrats in the House. But actually conducting corrupt dealings would not be worthy of even an investigation. What's troubling to me as a law professor who teaches First Amendment law is the way the New York Post article has been essentially censored within the United States. Other countries are writing about it more than the American media, and the big tech titans, of course, are actively censoring that story on social media platforms. When you take a look at their legal basis for doing so, it comes down to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which allows these tech giants to evade liability for defamation lawsuits. But in return, they're supposed to be neutral platforms, not publishers that are editing content. With one exception, the so-called Good Samaritan exception that allows them to remove content that is obscene or harassment or otherwise offensive. Well, the phrasing of otherwise offensive is so vague, it's hard to imagine it passing constitutional muster under the First Amendment. It would be probably struck down under the so-called vagueness doctrine that the Supreme Court uses to review any kind of legislation that restricts speech. And it's allowed these tech giants to have really unbridled discretion in censoring political speech in our country. Something's got to be done to change this, of course.
Now, this is some really important stuff that we touch on here, but before we continue, I want to take a short break. And when we return, we will continue with our discussion on big tech censorship, as well as what issues are being ignored in the mainstream press with regard to the US election. But before that, check out this commercial.
Pure journalism. Every journalist in the world should have been cheering Edward Snowden. He did what every journalist is supposed to be devoted to.
Because we have evidence that when we do that, things go wrong.
Welcome back to The Source, and thanks for sticking with us. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak. So Tim, we left off talking about big tech censorship, and I want to continue with that discussion. And of course, Twitter and Facebook have censored this article that we were just talking about that was published in the New York Post. And Twitter, in fact, took down the New York Post's account. Are you concerned that the big tech companies are in the pocket of the neoliberal establishment?
Absolutely. It's very clear to me they are. And what we see is essentially the government has outsourced censorship, so to speak, or the ability to censor to these big private corporations. And I believe the First Amendment needs to be extended to cover those big private entities as essentially operating a public forum. It's too important to the speech of our country. Most people are getting their information now through social media platforms and not even through going online to check out a mainstream media, whether it's broadcast TV or radio. So this has to change. And, the excuses that the big tech giants have given reveal a great double standard, a terrible double standard, I should say. They've said that they didn't want to publish the New York Post articles because they rely on unnamed sources. I mean, this is a joke. They've spent 4 years publishing and spreading articles based on unnamed sources, whether it was the Russiagate hysteria or the Ukraine impeachment, or more recently, the Atlantic Monthly had published a report that the president had called military personnel losers, completely based on unnamed sources. They also said they didn't want to publish anything that was based on hacked material, even though there's no indication that Hunter Biden's laptop was hacked. It seems as if the laptop had been left as a bailment with a company that was charged with repairing it, and Hunter Biden never came back for it. So it's not hacked material. And yet, again, they had published reports that were based on hacks and leaks in the past. So it certainly seems that they're putting their fingers on the scale to try to help one side, and that would be the Democratic establishment at this point.
So sticking with the First Amendment, you once said that free speech gave people voice and power to American democracy, but now we are told to parrot manufactured propaganda, the manufactured consent. Do you feel that U.S. elections are still open and free? And do people understand what they are voting for?
Those are good questions. And I guess let me take it one at a time. First, I don't believe we would pass much in the way of any kind of real standards for free and fair elections at this point. And that goes back to the lack of transparency in how the votes are actually counted. The United States is one of the only countries that calls itself a democracy that has not yet banned the electronic voting machines. Most countries have, because they realize electronic voting machines are inherently vulnerable to hacking and to insider manipulation. And that's what we should do. We should, for 200 years, this country counted ballots by hand in public. That's the only fair system to have. Now, there are some jurisdictions in this country, Columbia County, New York, for instance, which was required to count votes by electronic voting machines, but they would follow it up with a hand counting audit, hand counting of 100% of the ballots. And if you do that, that kind of an audit is so robust that it will deter any manipulation of the software, hacking of results. So we need to very much reform the way our elections are done and the way ballots are counted. And then you also raised the question about how informed is the electorate. And unfortunately, this is not a free, fair, vibrant marketplace for ideas. Not when you have only 5 giant corporations, big corporate conglomerates, that now own 90% of the TV, radio, and cable broadcast and print media. That concentration of ownership is so intense that what's censored and what's allowed reflects rather large corporate agendas. And then you take a look at the big tech companies, in addition, that control the social media platforms and the search engines, and you see that we really do have 21st century robber barons. And they're not just ripping off consumers, they're ripping off the public discourse, they're destroying American democracy by undermining the public discourse. And we need to approach it as if they are robber barons, the way Teddy Roosevelt did with Standard Oil more than a century ago. We need a robust response to this based on criminal antitrust enforcement actions.
Now, an issue that you and I are, of course, very passionate about is a free press. And you have been a very vocal defender of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Now, Joe Biden nor President Trump have been pressed on this issue recently. Do you think that Assange's situation could be impacted by the results of this upcoming election?
I do. I'm hopeful, let's put it that way. You know, I think if Joe Biden wins, there's not going to be a good outcome for Julian Assange. I think that the Democratic establishment is hell-bent on persecuting him and prosecuting him. Well, would it be any different in a second Trump administration? It's a fair question to ask. There are many who believe it wouldn't be, because after all, it's Trump's Justice Department that has indicted Julian Assange. Now, you might recall that Trump's Justice Department also indicted 2 associates of Rudy Giuliani in the Southern District of New York. So what does that suggest? It suggests that the president doesn't have complete control over his Justice Department. He wouldn't be the first president not to. And it certainly seems like he doesn't have control over some very key agencies of the federal government right now, such as some of the intelligence agencies. It's quite possible that the Eastern District of Virginia, the prosecutor there, may have been pursuing a prosecution that Trump would not have preferred. That's speculation. We don't know for sure if that's the case. I do think that there's much more of a likelihood of President Trump actually granting a pardon for Julian Assange in a second term. Why? Because Trump has an interest in the truth coming out about the allegations of Russian hacking of the DNC, which, of course, we've seen from the work of Bill Binney and Ray McGovern, the folks at VIPS. There's lots of reasons to believe that the Russians never hacked the DNC and that the leak was an insider leak. So out of self-interest alone, one would think that a second Trump administration might actually do some justice for Julian Assange. I certainly hope that's the case.
I do too. Now, speaking of Russia, of course, the Democrats are blaming these emails that were obtained by the New York Post. They're blaming this on Russia once again. Are you surprised that they're doing this? And do you think that the American people are buying into this narrative again?
I'm not surprised at doing it. When you go back to the first DNC leaks of the summer of 2016, perhaps because I was running against Wasserman-Schultz, I could tell from the very beginning, I had the impression that this was a false narrative. Dirty Debbie Wasserman-Schultz was one of the first to start espousing this false narrative, and there really was never much evidence to begin with. So this is what the DNC does. They would rather focus attention on Russia through lies and smears than to have an honest conversation about real challenges that the United States faces with a rising China, for instance. And I don't believe the American public is really buying this anymore. It's sort of like the boy who cried wolf. The DNC has been doing this just for so long that people are now rolling their eyes. Oh, it's Russia again. Anyone who's really followed the Russian collusion narrative from the beginning now sees it falling apart. I think it was just about 2 weeks ago where, through the declassification that's being done by the Director of National Intelligence, Ratcliffe, I believe they declassified a handwritten note by the former CIA director, when he was CIA director, John Brennan, to his boss at the time, President Barack Obama. And what did that handwritten note say? It said that they had information that candidate Hillary Clinton, this is in 2016, had approved of a plan to smear Donald Trump with false allegations of Russian collusion to take the heat off of her for her private email scandal, that she had put tens of thousands of her emails, official emails, on a private server. So the Russian conspiracy never seems to end for the Democrats. It's shameful that it's being pushed again. The Director of National Intelligence has already concluded that Hunter Biden's emails and laptop have nothing at all to do with Russia. Anyone with any kind of honesty who's looking into it will see exactly how Hunter Biden's laptop got into the hands of Rudy Giuliani and the FBI. He left it with someone who apparently got scared when he saw what material was on that laptop, and his initial response was to bring it to the FBI, and then to protect himself, apparently he made several copies of the hard drive.
So why is the corporate media in America not doing their job? They rarely ask questions about this Russian narrative. They're pushing it once again now in 2020. Why is that?
There's so much concentration of ownership and control in the media, the corporate media now. And when you look at surveys of journalists and editors, you see that over the past 20 years, a majority of them now say they lack autonomy. So the news is now a top-down authoritarian production. And if it's controlled just by those who control the corporate structure at the very top, it makes sense that there's corporate agendas that are favoring, let's say, the establishment parties over somebody who's an outsider who's trying to investigate and break up the establishment. You could go back into the history books, of course, and it shocks me how little of this is well known. In the 1970s, you had the Church Committee. Senator Frank Church chaired the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they were conducting investigations and hearings of the role of the U.S. intelligence agencies in overthrowing foreign governments. In the course of the Church Committee, and I should say Frank Church was a Democrat from Idaho. In the course of the Church Committee hearings, they uncovered the intelligence community's infiltration of the U.S. news media, and that would be Operation Mockingbird. At the time, the American public was assured by the CIA director at the time that the CIA had stopped infiltrating and paying American journalists. That CIA director at the time was none other than George Herbert Walker Bush. It's entirely possible that they hit the accelerator rather than the brakes. It wouldn't be the first time the U.S. intelligence agencies would have lied to Congress or the American public, and certainly not the last time. And at this point, with the increased concentration of ownership in the corporate media, they don't have to be buying individual journalists. They can just assert influence at the level of boards of directors, I would imagine, to get the news the way they want it. And then, of course, President Obama, I believe in 2014, in signing the National Defense Authorization Act amendments, got rid of or weakened the Smith-Mundt Act prohibitions of U.S. intelligence agencies actually deploying propaganda here in the United States as opposed to just overseas.
So I wanted your opinion on what sorts of issues you think are being ignored by the candidates, and specifically issues that really do matter to the American people that they deserve to hear about.
Sure. Well, I would put Julian Assange at the top of that list. I think it's an important issue because it does go to the problem of press freedom here, and that's been airbrushed out of this campaign completely. I think the quality and range of issues discussed has been very hurting across the board here. There's not been a real vibrant discussion of foreign policy, for instance. And I know foreign policy was removed from the last presidential debate by the commission that runs these debates. There hasn't been much of a discussion on the Federal Reserve. And you could say macroeconomic policy. Of course, as somebody who studies monetary policy in the Fed, I've noticed that. And it's an important area to discuss, of course, in light of the shutdowns that have occurred throughout the country and the Fed's response to it. While the COVID virus has been discussed plenty, I don't think it's been discussed in a very honest way. I think it's a very truncated discussion that we have. And we talked about social media censorship, and we see it happening on the science of the virus, the science of vaccines, the science of wearing masks. There is an official line that has to be towed. If you don't toe the line, you could be deplatformed or shadow banned. And this is not the way science should work. Science usually moves forward when there is a real debate on science, not in an official science sanctioned by the CDC, an agency that is very beholden to Big Pharma, and that anyone who questions it is smeared as unscientific. So I'm not happy with the way that the shutdowns have been discussed and the pandemic has been discussed.
Tim, before we do close out here, I have to ask you, what is your prediction of what's going to happen on Tuesday, November 3rd?
I must say that 4 years ago, when 90% of the polls were predicting Hillary Clinton to coast to an easy victory, I was convinced in the final 2 weeks that Donald Trump was going to win the election, and I was pretty much saying so to anyone who asked. And what was that based on? It was based on just too many people I met in the course of the campaign, and old friends even, who were telling me, or I should say whispering to me, that they were going to vote for Donald Trump. And my response was often, why are you whispering? And of course, they were whispering because they didn't feel comfortable publicly saying they supported Donald Trump because of the vote shaming that was going on. Hillary Clinton famously called Trump voters deplorables and irredeemables. And people who were leaning to voting for Trump learned they better keep their mouths shut and not let people they work with or socialize with, or in some cases, maybe even their spouses know who they were planning on voting for, but they would get their revenge on Election Day. And I do think the vote for Donald Trump had that kind of a silent majority. It was a big middle finger, I think, to the establishment. And my feeling is that's only grown in the 4 years since. So I don't have a very high opinion of the Democrats. And of course, I've seen personally the way they are ready, willing, and able to try to rig election results. I think both party establishments are capable of doing that. I think if it's a free and fair, honest election, I think Donald Trump is going to roll to a more decisive victory than he did 4 years ago.
Okay, Tim Canova, thank you.
Thank you, Taylor.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you all for tuning into this episode of The Source. Make sure that you do subscribe to our YouTube channel as we will continue with our coverage of the US election. And if you like the work that we do here, please donate to our organization so we can continue with our nonprofit independent news and analysis. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak, and I'll see you in my next report.